All right, what is up, everybody? So, haven't made a video in a very long time. I actually was on a pretty long break from Warframe, got kind of burned out from the Tau update last year. Started playing the game again about a month ago. Obviously, still love the game. So, why am I making a video? So, I'll post today. It was a new player. They had a few pictures of frames asking for advice on which one to make and invest in as a new player, a early game player, just doing the normal star chart. Ember was one of those frames. There was a couple others: Equinox, Loki, Valkyr. Everybody suggested Valkyr. Okay, fair enough. Valkyr is a very strong frame. Also, one of my most played frames. I love Valkyr, but one, she is at this point almost entirely melee focused. You can't really, like, I mean, you could play with ranged weapons with Valkyr, but like, why? And of course, the comments were completely chock full of tons and tons of Ember hate and whatnot. And as someone who, Ember is one of my favorite frames, I'm a little sick of the Ember slander and the glazing of World on Fire. So I've been playing Warframe a long time, probably like almost 10 years, better part of a decade at least, thousands of hours. I'm LR6 now. I was there, Gandalf. I was there 3,000 years ago, before Ember got reworked in 2019. And let me tell you, old Ember was straight up ass. Like, it wasn't like she was kind of bad. It wasn't like she was straight up terrible. And people will say, "Oh, well, I keep hearing that World on Fire was good." Yeah, it was good for, like, the same way that Excalibur's Radial Javelin was good, or back then, like, Mags 3 was a nuke ability because people were fighting like level 5 enemies. So, like, back then, there wasn't anything to do in the game. So people would just run normal relics where you fight like level 10 or 20 enemies, and that was it. Now, if you tried, like, the end game missions was like a Sortie 3 or a Kuva Flood, and you could not really do either of those with Ember because shield gating wasn't a thing. She didn't have damage reduction. You actually had to pray that your World on Fire's knockdown would proc on enemies, which was not a guaranteed chance. That was the only way for you to survive, was by CCing enemies with her 4. Her other abilities were terrible. Fireball was obviously still awful. Accelerant was only worked on buffing heat damage. I'm pretty sure that I still have, I think it was Opticore, Vandal. I think I still have an Ember Memes build on this. Let me just, yep, Ember Memes. It's there's nothing on here right now, but it was basically like, you wanted to find weapons where you could just put as much heat damage on it as possible because that's all Accelerant buffed. It looked like it was a huge damage increase, but it really wasn't. It was actually middling at best, very bad most of the time. So when Ember got reworked in 2019, I, as a huge Ember fan, was absolutely ecstatic. And she was one of the first frames that got a really big ground up rework. Honestly, it might have been the first. And it was a huge upgrade. She had damage reduction. She had armor strip. She had, at the time, her 4 was an incredible nuke ability. The only things that were better were probably like Maim and Saren. Now, Equinox is also considered terrible these days. Saren is like, pretty strong, but it's more from her weapon buffing capabilities, less from her nuking with miasma. So there are a lot, as the level of enemies we are fighting in the game has increased, there's kind of been this phenomenon where any ability that doesn't inherently scale with enemy level or enemy health is kind of just trash. So one of my favorite frames is Grendel. Play him all the time. And Grendel's abilities scale with enemy level. So his regurgitate, the toxin or gas damage, if you're using the augment, is basically always good. And it armor strips. There's also been multiple rounds of defense changes and stat rebalancing of enemies in Warframe since Ember got reworked. So we're at the point where enemies have capped armor reduction, but significantly more health to compensate. So again, any ability that does flat damage rather than a percentage of enemy health or scales with level or has some kind of non-ability strength related scaling, it just falls off. Like, you know, even for quote unquote normal missions like ETA, you know, as a normal weekly thing now, you're fighting like level 500 enemies. Something like Ember's 4 just can't keep up. Now, I always hear two kinds of frames brought up when I'm, you know, the Ember discussion in particular brings this up. So you might be thinking, if this video is about Ember, why the hell do I have mag on my screen? So Ember falls into a kind of unique class of frame, and it's actually my favorite way to play Warframe. But it doesn't really fit into the two big archetypes that people usually talk about. So usually people talk about nuke frames like Sevagoth, Dante, whatever, like where you have some kind of insanely high scaling ability damage that you can use to wipe enemies out really quickly at almost any level. So that's one kind of frame. And then people also talk about weapon platform frames. So those are frames where you have a bunch of buffs. Think, you know, like how Saren is played a lot these days, where you use her for, you know, her toxic spore or her toxic lash augment, her 3 tons of additional damage. You know, those are kind of the two big archetypes that people usually talk about. Now, Mag is my most played frame, is probably still my favorite frame. I would put her into a weird category where she doesn't have weapon buffs. She doesn't have nuke abilities, but I still love her kit and I still think she's really fun to play. And I would classify her as almost like a hybrid frame. So she has abilities that enable weapons, right? So, you know, if you get these enemies out, she has Polarize that will strip armor. It also generates the polarized shards. She has her 4, which does a little bit of damage, but more importantly, it strips armor, it disables enemies, it gives her and her allies shields, and then obviously you have Magnetize, which is not a damage buff on its own. However, you can see Magnetize interacts with her shards from her 3, and it can kill enemies by itself. And then obviously you can, you know, shoot into Magnetize, and, you know, there's a lot of fun interactions there. So Mag isn't really a frame that kills enemies with abilities or has like passive weapon buffs that you just set it and forget it. You just buff yourself and you don't really need to think about it anymore. She's more of like an active frame where she has abilities that complement weapons. You kind of need to use both. You have to use both weapons and abilities to get the most out of her. And I would say that Ember, in my opinion, so these are my most used frames. So Mag, Valkyrie is here, Ember is here. I would say that Ember falls into that category as well. Another frame for me that falls into that category is actually Mirage. Now Mirage is a very good weapon platform because of her 1 and 3, but I actually run a build on her where I use the 2 augment, I use her 4. I don't even use a Helminth ability on her because her 2 and 4 are actually quite good abilities once you get used to them. I think Banshee's a little different, but like, I actually think Trinity is a frame that I play like this, where I use the Link augment and I kind of use her abilities to complement my weapons. So why do I think that Ember is, this type of frame. I think it really relies on using her one augment. I think her one augment is very overlooked. I wish her one augment was just her baseline one. I wish they switched her baseline fireball ability with her augment. I think that would actually be a really good thing for the frame. But one thing you can look at is that her passive gives her a shit ton of ability strength. And this doesn't have a cap. This scales like, to infinity and beyond. Obviously, there's a limit by how many enemies are on your screen, but it's very easy to have a ton of enemies and get a ton of ability strength through your 4. So how is she like Mag, where she is a hybrid frame? Now, you're not really going to nuke stuff with her 4. She has good survivability with her 2. She can really abuse both the overguard gate and shield gate mechanic. So you can actually, with her 3 augment, obviously you're stripping enemy armor, which is nice, but you're getting overguard and you have shields. So you're not like Kullervo where you only have one or the other. You actually have both. So it's really hard to die on Ember. Like, if you're paying attention and like playing the game, frankly, it's kind of difficult to die with her. And her 4 kind of just goes into that feedback loop of like keeping her 2 meter up. Her 3 is going to spend that. So you want to use your 4 anyways to keep up your passive, then buff yourself with your 1. And her 1 is really nice because it doesn't combine with the elements on your gun. So this gun is running blast. So I can proc both heat and blast at the same time, which is really nice because one of the things with blast is it can kind of struggle with single target enemies. It's really good for AoE because it has that quadratic scaling, but it can struggle a little bit in AoE situations. So how I play Ember is kind of like how I play Mag, where, I'll use her 4, you get heat procs, you buff yourself with your 1, you have your damage reduction, you armor strip with your 3, and it also gives you overguard. Another nice thing, because one thing I see people complain a lot is like her 3 doesn't generate enough overguard. Okay, well, any amount of overguard makes you immune to status effects. So like you're kind of just constantly making yourself immune to status, and it just kind of works. Like, is she a nuke frame? No. Is she a pure gun platform frame that never has to use her abilities? Also no. But I play Ember in like ETA, high level missions all the time, and she does fine. Like, there are plenty of guns in the game that are stupidly broken, and you slap a, so with just these enemies here, that's a 220% heat buff on this weapon. So obviously it's going to, work pretty. I don't have any of my like galvanized mods stacked up or whatever, but like obviously it's going to work well. Also, very easy to use arcane hot shot with her. So that's another thing that is very easy for her. So I just like, I kind of feel like, and obviously this is really dictated by or influenced by the way that I like to play the game, where I like these frames where it's a mix of using abilities and buffs and like interacting with enemies. I don't really like frames. Frankly, like I think Rhino is boring as shit. I like never play Rhino. I never played Chroma. Like, I don't like frames where you just use a bunch of buffs and then you just use like a giga powerful weapon and just hold down left click the whole time. I think that that's really boring. Now, so do a lot of people like that? Yeah, I mean, the Occucore is a popular weapon for a reason. A lot of people like just using a lot of buffs and just holding left click and winning. That's fine, that's if that's how you want to play the game. But I think people forget that there are other ways to play the game. Like, you don't have to be a nuke frame or a gun platform. There is room in the game. There's enough design space to have these other kinds of frames. And I think Ember actually fits really nicely into that like hybrid frame category. Now, could Ember use like some tweaks? Sure. does, like, you know, maybe her energy from her 2 scales too fast, or, you know, maybe her 4's damage could be a little better. I don't like having to use an augment to get the buff on her 1. I wish that was like the baseline, you know, for her 1. But is she like gutter trash donkey tier like people always say she is, or is she like, you know, is her rework like terrible and we should go back to old Ember? Absolutely not. Like, old Ember would be the worst frame in the entire game by a massive margin, and it's not even remotely close. And I guess I was just a little annoyed at the Ember hate I've been seeing lately. So we'll see what DE ends up doing with her. I genuinely don't think she needs like another full rework. I think she maybe needs some tweaks here and there. But that's kind of it. So we'll see what they end up doing. You know, obviously you can let me know how you feel. I'm sure a lot of people will disagree with me, but you know, it is what it is. So thanks for watching, and you know, maybe I'll make more videos again sometime. See you around.